Okay, we are live. So I am so thrilled to be here. Thank you all for joining, and everyone who's watching on Facebook, please feel free to share. This is going to be a really awesome conversation. I am so thrilled to be joined by Anne and Eboni. And I just want to start by saying there is so much to say about suffrage, and we are going to talk about a lot of it. It was radical and exciting, one of the longest and most impactful social reform movements in the history of this country. It empowered millions of women and changed the trajectory of our democracy. It showed the power of organizing, strategizing, and persevering. It amplified the intersection of women's empowerment, racial justice, workers' rights, and so many other progressive issues. But in many ways, the ratification of the 19th Amendment was a starting point and not an ending point. It did not enfranchise Black women, Indigenous women, Asian women, Latinx women the same way it did for white women. It did not address the injustices along racial and ethnic lines that persist to this day in this country. So today, we are thrilled to have two extraordinarily powerful voices on these issues, the celebration as well as the long road ahead, women who have been leaders of the women's movement in remarkable ways, who have always kept an eye to the future, and work to mobilize, activate, and empower women and our allies in the continued fight for voting rights, civil rights, and justice and equality for all. So I'm going to start by telling you a bit about Anne F. Lewis, who was senior advisor to the 2008 presidential campaign of Hillary Rodham Clinton. She served as White House communications director for President Bill Clinton, as vice president for Planned Parenthood Federation of America, as political director of the Democratic National Committee, and as chief of staff to then Congresswoman and then Senator Barbara Mikulski. In 1998, President Clinton appointed Anne to be the co-chair of the President's Commission on the Celebration of Women in American History. And in 1999, she was appointed to be on the Women's Progressive Commemoration Commission, established by Congress to report on historical sites that were instrumental in American women's history. Anne has been a visiting lecturer at Brandeis University and at the Annenberg School of the University of Pennsylvania. She was one of the founding members of the National Women's Political Caucus, and she also has the largest collection of suffragist items in America, which she frequently lends to museums. And I really encourage everyone after this to check out her collection. She has a website, just Google Anne Lewis Women's Suffrage Collection. We will also send it in a link in the follow-up to this email. And I just, her bio, we could go on for hours with her bio, but I will just add that she is one of the first board members of Zioness, which is the honor of my life, certainly, to have Anne associated with our movement. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to quickly read, before I introduce Eboni, something that's on Anne's website that describes why she started collecting suffrage items and what this movement means to her, because I think it's extremely powerful. I'm not going to read the whole thing, so check it out, but I'm going to read a small part of it. As someone whose day job is in American politics, I am speaking as Anne, marvel at the courage and strategic sense of the women who won the vote. Think about their challenge. They had to convince an all-male electorate, state by state, legislature by legislature, and finally Congress and the White House to share political power. Not an easy goal at any time then or now. The suffrage pioneers were raised to believe that ladies did not speak in public, but they spoke on street corners and at county fairs. They went door to door in their own neighborhoods, faced the disapproval of fathers and husbands, and yes, mothers and sisters, climbed tenement steps wearing more layers of clothing than you or I wear in a week, faced repeated disappointments, and just kept going. Their work made our lives possible. What were the messages that worked to persuade male voters, and how did they figure them out without political consultants or opinion polls? How remarkable that women, legally excluded from the political system, figured it out, realizing the need to build coalitions and strategically target winnable referenda until they won the majorities they needed. So I just want to say that, having Anne to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the expert that she is, the icon that she is such a privilege. And Eboni is an incredible superstar. She is currently the host and executive producer of REVOLT Black News, which airs on REVOLT TV, founded by Sean Diddy Combs. Her bio is incredible, guys. She is a co-host on the network's hip-hop talk show, State of the Culture. Eboni has emerged as a powerful media voice in the national conversation where politics, law, justice, sports, and popular culture intersect. She is an attorney, best-selling author, television personality, and contributor to Forbes. Eboni's broadcast resume includes national anchoring and hosting roles for Fox Sports, Fox News Channel, NBA 2K, and correspondent and contributor roles with CBS News, HLN, CNN, and NFL Network. She made her literary debut with Pretty Powerful, Appearance, Substance, and Success, which I hope everyone will go online and order after this and read, in September 2017. Essence Magazine named Eboni, one of its Vogue 100 in the April 2018 anniversary edition. Eboni was also recognized as one of Blog Her's Voices of the Year. She has become a regular guest on the nationally syndicated radio show The Breakfast Club, breaking down controversial issues such as judicial discretion. Eboni has moderated conversations for former First Lady Laura Bush, Black Enterprise, and Essence Festival. She is a proud and active member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority, Inc. She also serves on the board of directors for Safe Horizon, which is the nation's leading victims assistance organization. Thank you both so much. What a privilege to have you. So let's jump right in. Anne, I was hoping you could give us a brief history of the suffrage movement, telling us sort of the state of the women's vote to the extent there was one, and the African-American vote to the extent there was one prior to 1948, and really what the landscape was where the suffrage movement was born and how it really began.
I think we're talking 1948, and you're right. What was the landscape like? And it's important to remember the idea of women winning the vote, demanding the vote, was so radical that when Elizabeth Cady Stanton was writing the proposal that would then come before the group at Seneca Falls, she included asking for the vote. Her husband, Henry, said that if she did that, he'd be so embarrassed, he would have to leave town. She did, and he did. Lucretia Mott, who as a Quaker had more experience in actually speaking in public than most women, still quailed at the idea of asking for the vote and said, Lizzie, they will make us ridiculous. Again, this was a huge step forward in 1848 for women, neither women nor African Americans. There might have been a handful of African American men who could vote in a few of the states, very rare. It was pretty much a white man's game at that point. So the meeting goes on, women come and a few men come to the church in Seneca Falls. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is reading through the resolutions. All of them are just sweeping through. And then she gets to the resolution calling for the vote. And the women are nervous. They start backing away. They're arguing. And Frederick Douglass stands up. Now, Frederick Douglass is tall. He is, as you know, quite dark. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is short and a little bit round. I like to think of the two of them standing there side by side and saying, okay, that's coalition politics. But Frederick Douglass gets up and explains why the vote is so important. In at least one of the history books I've read, he says, the franchise is that which underlies all other rights. Now, I can't find any other book that says that. These were not the days when people's words were taped and transcribed, so we cannot be sure. But Frederick Douglass understands the power of the vote as it is and as it can be. And because he gets up and says that, that resolution calling for the franchise passes. So you can say from the very beginning, this is intersectionality at work, perhaps. People from different experiences coming together to say, here's how we have to move forward.
Oh, Amanda.
Sorry, I muted myself. 21st century problems. So I wanted to say that if either of you want to jump in on the other before I ask the next question, obviously, feel free. So Eboni, I wanted to ask you about the segregation in the suffrage movement, and a lot of white suffrage leaders who refused to allow Black women and other women of color into leadership roles in their organizations because they feared that they would lose support, particularly in the South, because white men may consider allowing white women to vote, but having a conversation about Black women was a whole other thing for them. But there were some extraordinary Black women who refused to be left out, like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell, and some trailblazing Black women suffrage organizations that were massively successful in moving the 19th Amendment forward. So how do these women react to the racism of the moment and ensure that their inalienable right to participate in it was not taken away from them?
Indeed, exactly that, Amanda. You talk about Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell, and even this woman on my button here, if you guys can see, this is actually Harriet Tubman. And we don't often hear about Harriet Tubman when we talk about suffrage because we think of her as the great emancipator, along with several others. Frederick Douglass. See, I just want to take this moment to see, as Anne already pointed out brilliantly, this is such early example of intersectionality. None of these quest for rights and equality exist in a vacuum because they just cannot. So when you start talking about Harriet Tubman, that of course led the Underground Railroad and was the Moses of the time, she also, while not the designated leader in name that Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells became, but she was very much a strong supporter. She was actually one of the first people to speak at the newly formed NAACP, specifically on the issue of women's right to vote. But going back to Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell, they had some brilliant work that they did really side by side with one another, starting with the fact that they both were very active in the anti-lynching work of the time, and particularly going on in the South, where lynching was just a way of life. And so Ida B. Wells, in addition to her work as a suffragist, was also a journalist. And again, that's another important intersection because we know who controls the narrative and who tells the story is of essential nature to this work. So Ida B. Wells, doing her brilliant work, writing her newsletters, along with Mary Church Terrell, eventually co-found what is known as the National Association of Colored Women. That is still, to this day, an active and important role and organization in Black civil leadership and civility. And they did that, and the primary thing was getting women the right to vote. And they worked with a lot of white women, frankly. There was a lot of intersectionality at the beginning, but there were some hard times, as Anne mentioned. And at some point, it seemed to be a bit of a conflict of whose rights needed to come first. Because I think when you do this work, even at that time, there was an understanding of the notion of increment. But Black women, as you said, Amanda, were not going to be silenced and did not take kindly to being asked to, quote, wait their turn. And so they did that work, starting that foundation, also co-founding the NAACP, which Black women and men's right to vote was top of that list as well. And it's all important. And then, as you said, Frederick Douglass being such an important part of this work, he was also right there at those NAACP meetings. He was also right there, sorry, not the NAACP meetings, but rather the Seneca Falls meeting, as Anne talked about, and really speaking to this and saying plainly, the right has no sex. Right. And so when we talk about rights, there is no designation for gender and hierarchy. And that's revolutionary. It was revolutionary then, and it frankly still can be revolutionary now. And I think as we celebrate 100 years of the women's right to vote, I can't imagine my life looking anything the way it looks now without Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, and of course, Harriet Tubman.
Absolutely, Eboni. Well, these women and their courage, their bravery in stepping forward, they made our lives possible. Everything we take for granted that we can do is there because they broke out and sort of bared some of, they took some of the scorn and the arrows, but they kept going. Ida B. Wells, for me, is just a fascinating story because, again, as you say, starts as a journalist, right? Her parents, I believe, come out of slavery. Parents die, she raises young children, she's in Memphis, has to leave Memphis because she takes on lynching, winds up in Chicago. Out of that background, out of that experience, Ida B. Wells understands that the vote is power and how to use it. And when Illinois passes suffrage for women, in some races, not all, legislature decides women can vote for president, and some municipal offices, they're still holding back on their own office. But again, women understand too, like Ida B. Wells, you take what you can get when you get it. And when the Illinois legislature passes suffrage at the municipal level, Ida B. Wells then organizes the Alpha Suffrage Club, goes around, organizes, gets Black women to register, and within 2 years, they have elected the first Black alderman in Chicago. So it's one of the examples, black and white, of a woman taking what the vote can mean, understanding it means power to represent, to advocate, to organize, and using it and coming to, again, within 2 years, having an electoral victory.
And that's massive. I'll just, I mean, you're like, I just want to have a very long tea session with you, Anne, and get all of this wonderful.
Can I just sit on the side and listen to you guys?
Yeah. But Anne's exactly right. And what she's describing, we know, is the era of Reconstruction. And she's right. Of that era, of that brief moment in time where a handful of Black men and, you know, Black women encouraging those men that were eligible to vote, and the tiny bit of Black women that maybe had something. You know, we had Black governors in the state of Louisiana and other parts of the South. There were Black United States senators, Black congressmen, and there was really getting to be this swelling of Black political power. Well, very quickly, the federal troops kind of withdrew from the South, and that experiment known as Reconstruction was a distant memory. But it was a glimpse. It gave a glimmer as to what it could look like when people have access to the ballot. And frankly, I would say, Amanda, we're still as a culture trying to get back to that level of political power.
Yeah, and we will get to how much work there is to do and how we can activate all the people listening to do that work, because especially right now, I know we always say it's the most important moment ever, you know, how many times have we said that, but like literally it's the most important moment ever to protect voting rights. And we have, like, as a nation, we have to do that work. So we will definitely get to that. Okay, Anne, do you mind? I know you don't. So I'm gonna ask you to please tell us about some of the major developments. Like, what were the moments where, you know, in the suffrage fight, there were big moments where people felt a surge of hope and actually felt like we could actually do this. I mean, it was an intergenerational fight. This went on for 100 years or something, the suffrage movement, all in all. And so, you know, talking about the trajectory of it, obviously we can't talk about 100 years of history, but what were the big moments? And specifically, maybe you finish your comments with New York and to talking about the Jewish community's involvement in the success of the ratification in New York.
So let's talk about the big moments, as you say, coming along. First, and again, Eboni is absolutely right. This is taking place in Reconstruction, the period right after the Civil War, when America seems almost immediately is going backward, which is really a hard time for social reform movements, as suffrage is at once a social reform movement and a political campaign. So yes, you need to widen people's view of what is possible, and you also need to count votes and win a majority. And that was particularly hard in those Reconstruction years. But as you get to the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, we're now entering the progressive era. And what the progressive era means is that the definition of what government can do is changing. Now government is, you know, supposed to see that your milk is pure, that your food won't poison you, that working conditions are safe, that women can go to work, as they did in the Triangle factory, and not burn to death because the doors have been locked to keep the workers in and the organizers out. There are a whole series of issues that come up. We say this should be on the government agenda. And when that becomes the agenda, it is now easier to make the case to women why they should vote and to men about why women should vote. Essentially, the argument now moves from we should vote because we're citizens to we should vote because we can better meet our responsibilities as mothers, as wives. We can better protect ourselves as workers if we have the vote. And that is a big change starting beginning of the 20th century. It's the swing, if you will, and you can watch the change. So while in the second half of the 19th century, you have exactly 4 states that enable women to vote: Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, Colorado, and only 4, and not highly populated at that. Starting in 1910, you start seeing Western states, California, Washington, again, Oregon. You watch the progressive movement. As I've said, Illinois comes in 1911. You can almost watch this sweeping towards the east. And it is because women are now standing up and saying, we need this, it's good for us. We need it again to take care of our families, to protect ourselves. That's a political argument. The early argument was we're citizens and therefore we should vote. And while I would find that stirring, unfortunately, not enough other people did. But this argument about responsibilities, that works, that connects. And as you've said, Amanda, all the voters are men, right? Any of us who's been in a campaign, you look at who's your base, who are your swing base, they're all men. We've got to be able to talk to them. So talking about those responsibilities is the way to reach male voters. Now we get to 1915, and 1915 is a really tough year for suffrage. States, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, all have suffrage referenda, and they all lose. And when you look at the map, you see that again, starting from California, going east, you're doing pretty well, and then you hit this wall of eastern states. This is tough. You can't win a national election if you can't get at least one big eastern state. As it happens, the only eastern state in which legally you can bring back the referendum within 2 years is New York. Now this makes a lot of the suffragists, let us be candid here, many of them shared the nervousness, the prejudices of their times. New York was both the largest Jewish city, it was the largest immigrant city. More than half of New York City's population was foreign born. Think about the conversations we're having these days and the fears that are aroused about immigrants. Well, again, as I say, some things, there was a reason why some of these are deep-seated, but the suffragists have no choice. New York it is. So they go into New York, they organize, they go into neighborhoods, they have flyers in different languages, they have speakers, they work with the trade unions, especially unions like the garment workers, the cigar workers, the hat and cap makers, largely Jewish unions. You have meetings in Yiddish and in English. You have leaders organizing. Henry Street Settlement, which was founded by Lillian Wald, who created public health nursing. And to this day, if you go to New York City, you can visit the Henry Street Settlement, although the neighborhood has changed. They have a suffrage club. In other words, the fight for suffrage becomes interwoven in these immigrant Jewish neighborhoods. When the vote closes in 1917, 1,300,000 votes have been cast in New York State. Suffrage loses outside the city. Even Rochester, which was the home of Susan B. Anthony and so proud of their stateswoman, Susan B., even Rochester votes no narrowly. But outside the city, suffrage loses by 1,500 votes. Inside the city, they win by 103,000 votes. The margin in New York City is large enough to carry the state, and the biggest share of that margin comes from the Jewish and largely immigrant districts. 78 of the top 100 pro-suffrage districts are Jewish. The margins in those districts go from 76 to 93%. Well, when you're getting 76 to 93% in 31% of the city, you can sort of see where you would roll up a winning margin. What's also interesting is we don't know that. You have to read, as I've been doing the last quarantine months, to read a lot of articles and books and trace it down. That did not get a lot of attention at the time, and that's no accident. And the reason is because the suffrage leadership, now they have to win a national election. Well, talking about thank you to the immigrants in New York City who made our victory possible, was probably not, they thought, the strongest way to reach the rest of the country. And not only were they immigrants, some of them were socialists. So the suffrage leadership very generously thanks everybody, but they don't single anyone out. But if you go back and say, okay, it's a political campaign, where did the votes come from? Look at those immigrant Jewish districts in New York City. Look at those workers who are going to work every day, sometimes in sweatshops, sometimes in, again, not very safe factories, understanding that when women got the vote, everybody in their family was going to be better off and more powerful. And that's how we did it.
You're a suffrage encyclopedia. I mean, the
She
fact,
really is.
right?
I mean, I'm just transfixed right now, and is such a gift. But I just want to make this point. What I took from that, because of my work as a journalist and a storyteller, and my firm belief, and why I left the practice of law to work in broadcast, is because the messaging is so imperative, right? And that's really what I heard Ann speaking to, is that the breakdown of the electorate and how that was comprised needed to remain, that part of the narrative needed to remain buried so that it could be impactful nationally, as to not scare basically the rest of the nation into a very progressive stance for the time. Wow.
I think that's right. But again, I'll go back and say on the other part, the broader message about meeting our responsibilities, empowering mothers, right?
Yeah.
Enabling women to take care of their children. That's the message that really worked in every state. And that's the message you see growing as you look at the suffrage material.
Fascinating.
Fascinating.
Okay. So Eboni, going to the point that you were going to make before about how much work we still have to do, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Act, for people who aren't aware of how much there was left to do after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Chinese Americans were still not able to be citizens under the Chinese Exclusion Act. Indigenous Americans didn't have the right to vote until at least 1923, until they actually were allowed to become formal American citizens. And of course, Black people, were suffering under Jim Crow. So until the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act protected the rights of Black people to vote, there was, very little ability for that. And so, given that the Voting Rights Act, that the Supreme Court has allowed the Voting Rights Act to expire, and there is legislation now to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, and of course to name it after John Lewis, the civil rights icon and hero that we lost just a month ago. What do you think, in terms of the politics and the strategy and the messaging in moving forward the Voting Rights Act? We have partisan challenges. Zioness is a 501c3, so we don't, speak about partisan issues, but there are challenges, or we can't endorse or oppose candidates for public office. We could talk about the challenges. So yeah, how are you looking at this as a lawyer, as a commentator, as a brilliant political mind? What do you see as the future for that?
It's so much, right? So I just want to go back to Jim Crow, because that's so critical, right? So all of the, as Ann offered earlier, Black men technically got the right to vote, and when the 15th Amendment, I believe, passed or whatever, then, 1920, women technically, but in effect, no Black people were voting really hardly anywhere in the South. Why? Because of literacy tests, poll taxes, all kinds of things that were literally designed, created, and enforced to make sure that Black people didn't vote. They were literally terrorized by these lynch mobs all across the American South and going up the Eastern Seaboard, frankly. So there was just a very strict code of conduct that was enforced broadly that would keep Black people from the ballot box. And then let's go to the Civil Rights Movement, because it goes hand in hand with the Voting Rights Act. So these things came about in 1965. And they were really the very specific acts. We're hearing a lot of talk right now in this election cycle from the Black community and the culture about a Black agenda. Well, I can tell you what the Black agenda was all about in 1965, the right to vote. Okay, it was almost a singular issue, really. And I think that was extremely necessary for the time. As Ann already told us, the right to vote is the Oedipus, right? It is the foundational right of all the other inalienable rights, the rights to have property, the rights to attend college, all of them really come from this right to elect your leaders. So Dr. Martin Luther King and a litany of others, I'd be here all day naming all the great figures that were a part of that work, but they were finally successful in getting Lyndon B. Johnson to sign and enact a Voting Rights Act of 1965. The good news is that more or less, there's been a consistent bipartisan effort to always renew the Voting Rights Act when it has expired. But we do, as you said, Amanda, sit here in this moment with uncertainty, frankly. And I can't believe it's 2020 and I'm saying that, but I am. It's really up in the air, very literally, with the passing of the late great John Lewis, who, you know, as you also mentioned, everybody I've ever heard is now saying that they want to name that the John Lewis Voting Rights Renewal of 2020, which I think is so perfect. We have to just continue to, as a society that values democracy and values the right of representative government, if we are at all serious about that, we have to insist that no matter what administration moves forward in 2021, that John Lewis Voting Rights Act is renewed, because that is the very precipice of freedom for all people in this country, and is certainly where the freedom of Black Americans started. To the extent we are a liberated people in this country and seeking complete liberation, that would be my argument, it's all moot if we don't have that right to vote.
Yeah, I have two quick anecdotes that I was reminded of in this. And the first one is from a webinar that we did a few months ago, but still, you know, feels like 27 years ago, given the quarantine, with all of our friend Bakari Sellers. It was about voting rights and voter protection in this era, like during COVID. And I asked him to sort of reflect on how voter suppression has changed since the 50s. And he was like, it really hasn't changed.
Yeah, I knew. Yeah, he had to have said that. Look at Florida. Okay, so a good example of that is the state of Florida. Last election cycle, I think 2018, they had a measure on the ballot that allowed for formerly convicted felons to be able to reinstate their right to vote. Great. Then their state leadership decided to implement a modern day poll tax, you know, and insist upon the payment of thousands and thousands of dollars of fees and in order for those rights to be accessed. And that's a modern day poll tax. So I think that's an exact example of what, when Bakari says not much has changed, that's what he means. That type of clearly discriminatory, clearly prohibitive based, impact based legislation, you know, it undermines the very nature of a freedom to vote. And that's exactly what we saw in Jim Crow. It's what we saw in the civil rights struggle, and it's what we're seeing today.
Right. Let me just add on to that. They are the same tactics. If anything, the difference is people are saying it out loud now. And I think years ago, that was subtler. But look at some of what we're seeing right now. We're seeing a president of the United States who says you shouldn't vote by mail in the middle of a pandemic, when we know people are worried about their health, suddenly raising questions. A post office making it harder to get your ballots in the mail. What's really striking, a Supreme Court that openly weakened the Voting Rights Act.
Gutted it.
As Eboni said, that used to be a bipartisan act. When I worked on the Hill, of course, the Voting Rights Act would come up and it would be renewed, because that was basic to who we were as Americans. 3 years ago, the Supreme Court pulls out the pre-clearance section, guts the most important, most powerful section of the Voting Rights Act, and now we've got to go fight to put it back. So the tactics may be the same. Unfortunately, I think what's happening is they're being carried out more openly, more deliberately, and that makes it even more important to push back.
It does. And you know what? So glad you brought up the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, which happened 5-4 Supreme Court decision in 2013.
Right.
And the only reason, that example I gave you guys in Florida, and just know that stuff like that's happening all across the country in different places, that only happened because the Voting Rights Act was gutted in that way. It literally would not have been able to happen because it would have been a violation of standing Supreme Court precedent. But because of the gutting of the Civil Rights Act in the Voting Rights Act in 2013, it opens the floodgates now to the weakening of all of that. You know, just even basic things like the way poll watchers show up at precincts. All of that has been weakened now in a way that makes our entire democracy vulnerable.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to what Anne was saying about the Postal Service and vote by mail in a pandemic, especially given the fact that we all know it is, you know, unequivocal fact now that communities of color are disproportionately hit by this pandemic. So, you know, to shut down voting will disproportionately affect communities of color.
So by the way, to that point, Amanda, so part of my work is we know this, we all know this, we see it coming. So we have to mobilize our culture and our community in an entirely different way, because we know that if we're talking, and I just want to connect the tissue, right? Going back to the connective tissue of why it was so important for Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell and those Black women activists to fight for the right to vote and push so hard in correlation with their anti-lynching work. It's actually the exact same thing. So when we're talking about the protest around George Floyd or the young man that just was shot 7 times in the back in Wisconsin, it's exactly the same thing. It's a modern day lynching of young Black life in this country. And the right to vote is directly correlated with our ability to change the laws that hold law enforcement accountable for deadly force against citizens. So when you don't vote, we will never get the justice. The justice and the vote are tethered together, hand in hand. And that's our messaging. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that goes to the Frederick Douglass quote that Ann shared, that that the enfranchisement is the key to all the other forms of power and equality that we need to be fighting for. I'm going to do a quick Zioness plug for people who are watching. Please sign up for our mailing list, because we are about to put out a voting guide for how you can be active and proactive right now in this moment. We have, I don't know how many days, 69 days until the election. Again, this is not partisan, but increasing voter turnout is urgent to a functioning democracy. And so we are, going to be putting that out, I think, early next week. We're going to be, providing links, making sure that you're registered, where to sign up to do GOTV in your state, not partisan GOTV, just GOTV. And get out the vote if you don't know what GOTV is. And there are ways to sign up to be a poll watcher. As Eboni said, poll watchers, if they're not doing their job well, they're not making sure that people who show up at the polls have actual access to the vote, that they're not, turned away for some inappropriate voter ID situation. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that suppression is actually being carried out at the polls. I'm going to sign up as a poll observer. If you're a lawyer, you can do that. You have some sort of extra power as a lawyer. Eboni is a lawyer also. So there are, ways. I'm going to go, I think, to Pennsylvania, where I know there are going to be issues. So if you are able to do that, if you are young and not vulnerable or particularly vulnerable to this virus, and you can get masks and go and show up and do what you need to do, sign up for our mailing list and join your local chapter, because this is what we're focused on between now and November. So I just really wanted to take the opportunity to say that. So okay, so the next question. So I want to ask Eboni about Tennessee, which was the last state that secured ratification, the last state to ratify and to get past the 2/3 that you need to amend the Constitution. And although the cause of suffrage was not wildly popular in the South for a lot of the reasons that we've already discussed, a biracial coalition of Nashville women's groups lobbied for ratification and were successful. So first of all, this is awesome. And second, although of course it wasn't, ratification did not help Black women as much as it helped white women, but it's amazing that these coalitions were able to move the ball forward in the way that they did. And so reflecting on that, what lessons can we take away as activists who know how much is left to do to protect the vote, and how to build diverse coalitions that can be effective and successful? And this is so important in an era of intersectionality, which is applied in challenging ways, especially for the Jewish community, but not asking you to reflect on that. How do we make sure that our coalitions are strong and unified and diverse and taking into consideration, everyone's needs?
It's a big question, Amanda, right? Because no, it is. And it's important to really, I think, respect and unpack it, because the reality is, since intersectionality has been a thing, it's been a challenge. Why? Because what you're asked to do when you combine interest, you're asking for people to buy into more than one agenda. So let's use the suffrage argument, right? So as Ann exactly said, your audience was all white men, because that's who had to vote, and that's whose buy-in you were seeking. So it's already challenging to get white men to buy into the equality of white women. So that's just a gender buy-in. When you add Black women on top of that, now they have to buy into gender equality and racial equality. Okay, so now we've really complicated the issue, and that is why, frankly, it was so challenging and remained challenging even when we saw, the feminist movement in its entirety has always struggled with this issue of intersectionality, particularly among white and Black women, for this very reason. I mean, we look no further than when Shirley Chisholm ran for the the presidential nomination for the Democratic Party. I see Ann smiling there. Yeah, in 1972. And unfortunately, she was not, to her satisfaction, adequately endorsed and supported by Gloria Steinem at that time. And that remained, you know, a fracture really between Black women's kind of radical and empowerment moments of the 70s throughout. And to this day, you know, there is still, there's a history there. I'll say that. And I think when, for instance, and that's why we have what's called the womanist movement. And a lot of people aren't familiar with that, but that is a segment. It is a derivative of the feminist movement that specifically talks about the equality of the rights of Black women in this country and across the globe. So to your question, how do we make sure in this moment where all the stakes are on the line? I totally agree with you, Amanda. In my lifetime, at least, this is the most important election of my lifetime. How do we make sure that all of our interests as women, Black, white, Jewish, Asian, Latin, Native American, Asian, how do we make sure LGBTQ, right? How do we make sure all of those interests are aligned? I think we have to do a very important thing with messaging, going back to Ann's brilliant point of how important that consistent messaging theme is. If we can get buy-in, we have to eradicate the notion of scarcity. I don't know if there's any Brene Brown fans in the room tonight. Shout out Brene Brown. Yeah. Brene Brown does brilliant work on the false notion of scarcity. Scarcity is the very nature that allows for groups of people, particularly when we talk about marginalized groups of people, to view one another as threatening, right? And that goes to the Oedipus as to why there's such success with narratives that condemn immigrants or condemn and otherizes other aspects. It says that there's only enough for a small pool of people to be okay. And any additional people to that pool means a threat to me and mine. So if we eradicate that, and I know that, you know, whatever your faith system is, if you have one, or maybe your just personal value system, is one of abundance, you know, and that I know I've been to enough Shabbat dinners to know that abundance is a very strong value within the Jewish community. I am a Black woman that grew up in the Southern church. You know, we serve an abundant God. You know, so if anybody can buy into, that's what I would say, Amanda. That's my answer. I want people to buy into the notion of plenty and abundance. And if you truly buy into that and believe that, you see your sister, no matter what other differences show up, as her success is your success, her freedom is your freedom. And as Fannie Lou Hamer said, when Black women are free, everybody's free. Because in a society that for, you know, sad historical reasons have really put the rights and freedoms of Black women at the very, very bottom of the list in our entire nation, well, when we are free by default, that means that everything and everybody around us is free. So I would really say the answer to that is changing the narrative around scarcity to one of abundance. And when we believe collectively in abundance as allies and sisters, amazing things happen.
I literally have goosebumps. That was amazing. Thank you. Wow, I hadn't heard that, and I haven't heard Renee talk about that, so now I have to find it.
We can't really make the race correlation. That's going to be my next book. Go ahead.
Okay. Ready for that? And we'll do another webinar with you talking about your book. Okay, so I just want to backtrack a little now and talk about, and I know you both have a lot to say about this, about the very strong and fascinating relationship between the suffrage movement and the anti-slavery movement. I know we talked about it a little, but there's so much more to say. Obviously, Frederick Douglass, we could talk about him for like 5 hours, but yeah, just whatever reflections you think are most important for people to understand about, you know, the very intrinsic relationship between those two movements.
Well, you're right. It is very interesting, and like it's almost like watching a family that sometimes quarrels and then comes back together. So in the beginning, as we talked about in Seneca Falls, for example, it was quite natural that Frederick Douglass would be there. They knew one another from abolition days, right? Here's this Frederick Douglass who is almost only a few years out of slavery. He knows Henry Stanton, who is Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband, because Henry Stanton began as an anti-slavery as an anti-slavery lecturer. That was his job at the time. Now, Elizabeth's husband, Elizabeth's father didn't think that was quite a good enough job to raise a family on, and Henry went on to become a lawyer. But their roots for most of these women are in abolition, in the end of slavery. They understand it to be this deep moral problem. Get to the Civil War. And to be honest, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony do not trust Abraham Lincoln. They think he's a squish on abolition. Abraham Lincoln has said his bottom line is to preserve the Union. So they're not sure he's going to do the right thing. They go off and create the Women's Loyal League and get hundreds of thousands of signatures calling for the 13th Amendment. The Civil War is over. The 13th Amendment has been passed. The 14th Amendment, due process, right, has been passed. They are now working in the American Equal Rights Association, hoping for suffrage for the excluded, women and African Americans. And the 15th Amendment comes along in draft, and it extends suffrage to males, white and black males. For the first time, the word male would appear in the Constitution, and that fractures the suffrage movement. The women who've been working all this time are bereft. They're being left behind. They thought we would enter, as one says, we would enter arm in arm. We would enter together. And the result is the movement splits. One group, Anthony and Stanton, they go off and form the National Suffrage Association. One group, headed by Lucy Stone out of Boston, forms the American Women's Suffrage Association. Lucy Stone says, I am content that the black man should enter before me, but now it'll be our turn to catch up. I said earlier that we don't have tapes and transcripts of these meetings, but in the history of women's suffrage, the 6-volume set, someone has written down the words for the meeting that argues about the 15th Amendment. And it is so powerful. And Frederick Douglass says, you were my friends. I came to your homes when I could come to few homes. But now, when the black man is under attack, we must have this protection. One of the women says, yes, but isn't that true for black women? And he says, because she's black, not because she's a woman. And so you see people who had worked together for years coming apart on, as Eboni said earlier, who comes first? It's not that both aren't wanted as goals, but how do you do it? If you can't do it all at once, what happens first? I would say 20 years later, by now the 15th Amendment is in the law and we're moving on. The two organizations merge, which is why you now have the clunkiest name in political history, the National American Woman Suffrage Association. They simply combine both names. And the organizations and the people merge. And Frederick Douglass goes on his last day on earth, goes to a women's rights meeting. He's now living in Washington. He's registrar of the state for the District of Columbia. The last meeting he goes to is for a council of women. When he dies, suddenly that evening, he's coming home, he's talking to his wife about what he's seen. He dies. His family invites Susan B. Anthony to speak at his funeral. So that's why I say for me, the relationship is not just about the issues, but it's people who have worked together, who striven together, if you will, in a great cause. They have argued sometimes about strategy and tactics, but at the end of the day, humanity and a world that can be bigger and better than the one we're in because everybody will be included. That commitment is biggest of all.
Fabulous.
Do you want to jump in? Or
I don't know how to follow that. What was the question again?
So no need.
I was transfixed. I'm sorry. What was the question about?
About the relationship between the suffrage movement and the anti-slavery movement.
Oh, okay.
I know you have stuff.
I don't think there's much to add. I mean, Anne is truly prolific, seriously, with her knowledge base here. It's incredible to listen to. But everything she said, and then, specifically going back to the Frederick Douglass piece and the journalism piece, I'm just obviously personally biased, but I'm transfixed by that correlation. So Douglass is famous, of course, for his North Star paper. Yes. And it it's just iconic. And I love that he took time to address the women's suffrage movement and specifically the plight in great detail in the North Star, which was really supposed to kind of be about Black rights, antebellum, anti-slavery, equal rights for Black people. But in it, he says this: in respect to political rights, we hold woman to be justly entitled to all that we claim for man. We go further and express our conviction that all political rights, which is expedient for man to exercise, is equally so for women. So all that distinguishes man as an intelligent and accountable being is equally true of women. And if government is only just which governs by the free consent of the governed, then there can be no reason in the world for denying to women the exercise of the elective franchise or a hand in making and administering the laws of the land. Our doctrine is that right is of no sex. And that was in the North Star. And I think that's just telling because basically he's doing a very early rendition of availing his platform to another issue, right? And that to me is what allyship is all about. It is saying that I've built this platform on maybe this one particular issue. In the North Star's case, of course, the equality of Black life in this country. And he's saying, I am using this platform to advance, amplify, and empower the issue of the women's right to vote. And I think that is the perfect example of what that intersection, crossover, complementary work looks like.
Okay, so I'm going to say for anyone watching, and I will check on Facebook, although every time I pull up the Facebook, the sound conflicts. So better to share if you're on the Zoom. I know way more people are watching on Facebook. If you have questions, put them in the Zoom chat. We don't have a ton of time left, and I do have thousands of questions still, so no pressure. But if anyone has an urgent question that they want answered, please feel free to comment it, and I will try to get it in there. So I want to just talk for a little bit about the different strategies that work together. So, we've talked about political strategies and language and messaging. There are also legal strategies. I know, Eboni, you talk about this all the time, that, there are things that we demand as a society that will not change unless the laws change. And then there are cultural changes that need to happen. So, I mean, even after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, that we still to this day have so many cultural issues. Racism is so embedded in the institutions of our country that it's hard to overcome, even with legal and political support. So, how, in terms of reflecting on, social, cultural, civic, and legal ways that we can protect the vote moving forward. I know, we talked about the Voting Rights Act already, but thinking back to then and thinking about the lessons that we can apply for now, do you guys have any thoughts on the relationship between the different pieces of the strategy?
I'll speak to humanizing, right? So if we reverse engineer why racism is so embedded in America, it is because the first Black people to ever really be in this country in any large number, they come from the picture that's behind me. If you guys can see that, that's an image of the Middle Passage, right? So how do people enslave other people? That's not normal, that's not civil. So in order to enslave your fellow human, you have to make him not human. That's the first step in that. So you have to strip that individual of their humanity. You make them chattel. You tell and believe a narrative that says that this individual is without intelligence, without just a sense of decency and the ability to live civilly by themselves. So they must be enslaved. They must be made to be submissive. They must be dominated, and they must be subordinate. That is how that works. So you don't just pass, the 13th and 14th Amendments and ding, oh, look at there. This person that was my slave for 40 years is now all of a sudden my fellow mankind. It doesn't work that way. So I'm saying that to say this, as we fast forward and think about just how society and culture, Amanda, to your point of cultural change, I think that we are still very much struggling with the full humanizing the full humanizing, the full reinstatement of human dignity and presumptions of intelligence and empathy and civility of Black people in this country. And that to me is the strategy. That's personally why I got into broadcasting. I went into television, into radio, specifically on the network that I really launched my career on, to humanize Black people for that audience. And we can debate whether or not that was worthwhile or whether it was impactful, but I can tell you that was my strategy though. That was literally the strategy, was to show up as an educated, heartfelt, impassioned, enthusiastic, self-assured Black woman to an audience that probably otherwise doesn't interface with that very often, to give it a human face, give it human connectivity, in hopes that by humanizing Black people, it would advance our political engagement and everything else.
And if anyone's wondering what network, you can look up Eboni's bio. I did mention it at the beginning. And I've never heard you address that actually. So
yeah, that was the big thinking there. So
really, really interesting. So, okay, so I'm going to close with my last question and then a quick anecdote. Actually, I'll tell my anecdote before I ask the last question, then you guys can have the last word. I was talking to a friend and mentor yesterday, actually, who happens to be the first Black Attorney General from New Jersey, and he is just so extraordinary. And every time I feel like, you know, we're on the precipice, this is the end, you know, he brings me back. And I was talking to him yesterday about my fears for democracy and this election, and he said, you know, when we as a society, as a country, have faced some of our biggest challenges, you know, we don't always see what's to come. We don't always see what happens after that. We're living in the moment and we're afraid, but we don't see what rebuilding looks like until later, until we actually meet that moment. And he gave the example of the assassination of JFK. And he said that was a horrifying moment to live in America. Like, you know, to feel the president had just been assassinated, there was no leadership. What happened? What happens next? How do we fill the void? And he said LBJ wouldn't have been in office had JFK not been assassinated. Not that he was celebrating the assassination of JFK, of course he was not. But LBJ came into office, and JFK never could have politically, would have never had the courage or the power to push through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And LBJ was able to work with the Southerners, the Dixiecrats, who, you know, who would have never worked with JFK to move forward the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So, you know, he's like, when you think about that, you know, what happened after that, how we met those moments, how we overcame the fears that we had in those moments, we won't know until later what we're able to do with the mess that we're living in now, until we build it back and we look back and say, it had to break for us to fix it. So that gave me hope, and I wanted to share it because I know a lot of people feel exactly the same way I do, which sometimes can be hopeless, but there is hope, and we all have to, you know, do the work. So I am thrilled to have, you know, both of you and all of the Zionesses that are committed to that. I feel really lucky to be surrounded by people who have so much passion and commitment. So I will end with the question of history repeating itself. So we've talked about this already, you know, with the fact that voter suppression efforts don't really change. They may morph a little, but ultimately it's all the same thing. Given the challenges that we have faced as women, as Black women, as Jewish women, as activists for equality, in so many ways, I hope that history won't repeat itself, but I fear that it will, and it already is. So this time we have a lot of lessons to learn from and opportunities to do better. So what are each of your biggest takeaways from suffrage and or the civil rights movement? Because, you know, suffrage obviously was not inclusive. What are the strongest lessons that we can take from the activism and the successes that we have had, which are big, and sometimes I think we have to remind ourselves how big, you know, the victories were, because it feels like, you know, we're suffering now. So, you know, I think we need to remind ourselves we've had big victories and we'll have more. So what are the best lessons, and how do we apply them in 2020 and beyond?
I'll start and say, when I think about suffrage, I think about it a lot. And if you come to our apartment, I've got, you know, our suffrage material is all over the walls, and I didn't really start putting it in notebooks until I ran out of wall space. When I look at what those women did, when I think about what they did, how little they had to work with, and we're not talking about, this is long before there was equal pay or decent economic opportunity. When I think about the expectations that kept them down, the walls of opposition they faced, and they kept going. And the reason they kept going, they knew they could make a difference. Hard, easy. When they lost a state, they lost New York in 1915, crushing disappointment. 2 days later, they had a big meeting and started raising money for the next campaign. Because you only win what is worthwhile if you keep at it. You know, if you could, frankly, if you could win it in half an hour, it might not have been such a big deal. If you want to change the world, if you want to make the world better, be prepared to spend a lot of time, a lot of thinking. But we can do it. That's what we can learn from those women. Look how they enlarged our world. Look what a difference their sacrifice has made for us. And now what are we going to do for the next generation?
Wow. That's real. That's real. And I'll say this. So when Amanda so graciously read my bio at the start of the call, she mentioned that I was a proud member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, right? And we were founded in 1908. And very shortly after that 1915 march in New York that Anne so poignantly referred to, my sorority sisters were there, and they had banners. They said Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, Howard University, 1908, and they were marching. And right beside them, you know who was there? Mary Church Terrell and her Delta Sigma Theta sisters. They were marching. And these Black women knew damn well they were not going to get the right to vote at the same time their white counterparts were. But they understood that they needed to be there, they needed to show up, they needed to do the hard work that Anne's talking about to lay the foundation for them to be able to walk into enfranchisement, okay? So when we see a woman, same member of that same sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, being the vice presidential nominee for a major party in this country, you can't tell me that change can't happen. But now, and Anne said this too, enfranchisement, the right to vote, it's a position of power. And a lot of people have fought and died for all of us to have it. And yes, it's being challenged. And yes, the Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013. And yes, there's going to be all kinds of crap going on with the Postal Service, and machines are being thrown out, and they're going to try to do all kinds of bull crap. But you know what? I truly believe if all of us that have the power use the power and exercise and step into this power and don't feel hopeless, even though that's really understandable, Amanda, but we have to step into our moment of power, whether you liked or you didn't like the outcome of the last presidential election. This is your opportunity to do something about it. And that's the end I'll say on that.
Amen. I have nothing else to add. Just thank you both so much. I am so happy that we had this conversation recorded for posterity. I honestly think that this is so important and so empowering, and I feel better, and I hope people watching feel better. And the comments on Facebook suggest that they do. And I love you both. I adore you both. I'm so grateful for your leadership. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Amanda. And thank you, Anne. This was my great honor for this year. Thank you. You are a living legend.
Someday we may all be in the same room again.
I hope.
The next Zioness party, we will all be in the same room again with all of our favorite people.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. This was fantastic. I actually had a lot of fun. Thank you.
Me too. I loved it. Bye.
Bye.